when they actually land on the other side of Niagara River on Canadian soil, they have a force of about 800 men at that point. They go to Old Fort Erie, which was the site of a very notable battle in the War of 1812 and hallowed ground for a lot of Canadians, and actually raised the Irish flag over the ruins of Old Fort Erie as a statement they were starting to take possession of at least one town inside Canada. So that's how they get across the river. And John O'Neill starts cutting railroad tracks and telegraph wires to prevent the communications. And the Canadian Defense Forces finally start to organize, and there's a combination of regular British troops and the Canadian militias, who are in some cases composed of farm boys and students from the University of Toronto who are pulled right out of their studies for their final exams and given a gun to fight the Irish invaders. And in many cases, they're just boys, and they've never even fired guns in their life. So John O'Neill has 800 men, but he's got 800 pretty experienced men compared against the defense forces that he's going to go against.
When do they first encounter each other, the defense forces and the Fenian Brotherhood?
So it's on the morning of June 2nd, 1866, and O'Neill has started to march inland, and outside a village called Ridgeway, which is about 20 miles south of Niagara Falls, O'Neill sees the defense forces coming, and he stations himself on top of a limestone ridge, and he sees that he is outnumbered in this fight. And the battle begins, and the Canadians press the Irish back towards this ridge. And O'Neill sees that he's going to have to do something that he can only do with a troop of experienced men, and he basically orders them to continue to fall back until he's ready to finally give a signal. So as the Canadian forces get closer and closer to him, O'Neill sees his Irish troops falling back, and then he gives a signal when he's ready and comes up over the hill on top of a horse with another one of his officers on top of a horse and gives the signal to charge. And then the fight begins to turn. And the Irish forces, and they call themselves the Irish Republican Army. This is sort of the first use of the term. So the IRA starts to get the better of the battle, and when the Canadian commander sees that John O'Neill is on a horse, he thinks that the IRA is ready to launch a cavalry charge. So what he does is he organizes his defense forces in what is a battlefield technique of putting all his men in a square. Problem is, it's not a cavalry attack, and the men are basically sitting ducks there. So the IRA starts firing upon them, starts routing them out, and then the Canadians and the British are forced to flee. I mean, they're just throwing their guns down, going on the run, and it's a complete victory for John O'Neill at the Battle of Ridgeway. And it's the first victory by an Irish army over the British forces of the British Empire since 1745. So it's a big victory. There's probably about 20 men who were killed on both sides of this battle. So it's a victory for John O'Neill, but he's also at this point wondering, he's been on Canadian soil for 36 hours, and he has not seen any more reinforcements come from Buffalo. He has not seen any help from any Irish Canadians that had been expected. So even though he scores his victory, he has to circle back to Fort Erie along the Niagara River, where he sees that the American forces are now out on the river preventing any further passage. And when O'Neill arrives in Fort Erie, there's another shootout. Basically, it's house-to-house guerrilla combat in the streets of Fort Erie, and O'Neill emerges victorious in that again. So he's scored 2 victories, but he sees that night that he's going to get no more men, no more supplies. So he then knows that he has only one thing to do, and that's to retreat back to the United States. So he lines up all the Confederate prisoners of war that he has captured. They think that they may be going to the firing squad at that moment, but O'Neill then just goes one by one down the line, shaking their hands and vowing to them that he's going to return to Canada sometime in the future, and he's going to ultimately be true to his word in doing so.
How long were they in Canada? It was about 3 days?
They're in Canada for about 48 hours.
48 hours, okay. Okay, so are there any other actions within this campaign, the Irish Republican Army, to seize Canada, or does it fizzle out at this point?
So what happens is the news of this attack causes a great sensation around the country, and the Irish start flooding into Buffalo. There's about 15,000 of them there, but they can't get across the river to do any support. There are other Irish who have been gathering in upstate New York in towns such as Ogdensburg and Malone, which are close to the Canadian border. And there's another pocket where they're converging, which is in northern Vermont around the town of St. Albans. So when news of O'Neill's battle and then retreat hits, Thomas William Sweeney, who's the commander of the forces, he's traveling up to upstate New York and then over to Vermont. And finally, by this time, President Johnson pulls the plug on the entire operation and orders all the Fenian leaders arrested. So John O'Neill's arrested, all the men who took part in the Battle of Ridgeway are arrested, and Sweeney is taken into custody. And when Sweeney's taken into custody, the Irish who are still free, they launch a small raid into Quebec from northern Vermont. But there's not much that really happens in this, certainly compared to what happened at the Battle of Ridgeway. The Irish, again, are over the Canadian border, not very far, just they make their camp a few hundred miles over the border, and they venture a few miles inland. But all that happens is they return with a Union Jack they had taken off of a custom house and come back to America after about spending 48 hours there, because, again, they see that there are no reinforcements that are coming, so there's no possible reason for them to go into battle. So that ends the attacks in 1866, but it really supercharges the Fenian Brotherhood, actually, in terms of the support it gets from Irish Americans. And then you also have politicians from the Democrats and the radical Republicans who then see the Irish as an up-and-coming voting bloc and start to court these Fenian leaders who took part in the organization. So even though they lose the battles, they are starting to, the organization still endures after those raids in 1866.
Right. I could see somebody just taking the raid in isolation and looking at it with a condescending tone of, oh, look at this force of 800 people thinking they can conquer Canada and bring the British Empire to its knees. But this is just one small action of a large organization. We have to look at that organization in total. So what else is the Fenian Brotherhood doing at this time? In addition to this raid, are they also trying to pick away at the British Empire in other places too, outside of just America and the American-Canadian border?
So there's still Fenians who want to stick with this plan of launching the uprising in Ireland itself. So in 1867, there are Fenians who then start to prepare for another revolution there, and they will start to bring guns, and they start to travel to Ireland to launch an uprising that occurs in early March of 1867. That is a complete and utter disaster, and doesn't go anywhere. So there's still that segment that is looking to Ireland as being the place where they want to launch the attack. But most people still, they're not discounting this idea of attacking Canada. It's still the closest place. They think that they had a great plan, and if it weren't for the American government, that they were well on their way to actually overtaking Canada, which, I think is certainly, let's say, looking through green-colored glasses at that what occurred in the Battle of Ridgeway. So it's really, those are still the real focus of the Fenians, and there's thoughts of Bermuda being a place that maybe they could go after the British as well, but no, those ideas really never gained any traction.
I think you wrote that they executed prison breaks from an Australian penal colony, and there were political assassinations. What did that look like?
So in Australia, you have the Fenians who were arrested in Ireland for their attempts in the revolutions are transported to Australia. And there are several of them who will escape from Australia, and that occurs with some of the prisoners, such as John Mitchell and Marr, and they will they escape out of there before the Civil War. And in the 1870s, the Fenians in the United States helped to organize another outbreak from the penal colony in Western Australia, and that was a rescue in 1876 by a New Bedford whaleboat called the Catalpa. And that was organized by John Boyle O'Reilly, who he himself was a Fenian who served in the British Army but was recruiting for the Fenians, and he was eventually sent to Australia, and he managed to escape on his own out of there, and then came to America as an enthusiastic Fenian, and then saw what was the debacle that happened later on with the Fenians in 1870, 1871. The political assassination occurs in Canada, and that is with Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who's a really interesting character in the book. So he is a member of the Young Ireland Revolution in 1848, and a real firebrand against the British. Even standing out against all these guys who hated the British, he was had a real poison pen towards the British. Comes to America, and then sees the discrimination encountered by the Irish in America, and starts to sour on America. Ends up going to Canada, and becomes part of the political establishment there. And of course, the political establishment was a British political establishment. He becomes a member of Parliament. He is a trusted advisor to the Prime Minister, and many Fenians think that he is a turncoat, and he is shot outside of his boarding house in Ottawa one night after giving a speech in Parliament. And he dies, and it's still the only federal assassination of a federal politician in Canadian history. And there was a manhunt, and the suspicion was that the Fenians were the ones behind the assassination, and they arrested a Fenian, tried him, he was convicted, and then he was executed in the last public hanging in Canadian history. But there's still doubts about whether they got the right guy here, and whether this was just a case of anti-Fenian hysteria that led to them rounding up and finding this one person guilty of the crime of the assassination of Thomas D'Arcy McGee.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. How do you interpret the legacy of the Fenian Brotherhood and this raid? Do you see it as something one-off, or did it begin a groundswell? And it's interesting, as you mentioned, that the name of their invasion force was the Irish Republican Army. Is there a through line from that to the 20th century version, or is it something else entirely? So how do you see the legacy of this raid and the Fenian Brotherhood?
So there's two big legacies. One is that the Fenians do bring self-government to a country, but ironically, it's not the one that they intend. It's Canada. So in the aftermath of the Battle of Ridgeway in 1866, and these threats from the southern border, as Canadians saw it, they didn't think that the British were doing a great job in terms of defending their territory. So it gave a real push to an ongoing effort for Canadian Confederation. And in 1867, basically a year after the Battle of Ridgeway, Canada becomes its own self-governing entity with its parliament